at the end of the day, we all have this desire to be liked.
It's so true. And, my case, sort of that fear of being rejected is something that controlled my behaviors, especially when I became the CEO, because I thought the only way that people would like me is if I had all the answers. So I was controlling. Felt like I had to do everything. If I thought I was wrong, I would divert everyone's attention on some shiny thing in the corner.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want them to not like me, when in fact, people like you a lot more when you admit you actually don't know something. That's the crazy thing is.
You're listening to The Pivotal Leader, where modern leaders talk about the moments that shifted their organizational cultures and pivoted their teams to success. Hey, this is Gina Trimarco, Chief Results Officer of Pivot 10 Results, a strategy and training company that helps businesses shift from people problems to performance results. Each week on The Pivotal Leader, I feature inspirational leaders who know how to positively impact their customers, employees, and brand through culture building. But before we jump in, here's a pivotal fact for you to consider. Your survive versus thrive ability hinges on your investment in your employees and your customers. If you don't provide meaningful, purposeful training and growth opportunities for your employees and results for your customers, they just might leave you and head straight for your competition. If you're looking for fresh ways to keep your stakeholders engaged, shoot me an email at gina@pivot10.com or visit our website at pivot10.com. In this episode of The Pivotal Leader, I spoke to Brandon Black, co-author of Ego-Free Leadership, Ending the Unconscious Habits That Hijack Your Business. Brandon retired as the CEO and director of Encore Capital Group in 2013. During his 9 years as president and CEO, the company built significant cost and operational advantages, expanded into new asset classes, and made acquisitions that established Encore as the industry's leading debt management and recovery solutions provider. So let's listen in and learn. Brandon, welcome to The Pivotal Leader.
Gina, thanks for having me on today.
I am really intrigued by the work that you do, by the book that you've written. And I recently read one of your articles, Workplace Politics Are Your Fault Too, where you discuss how we can unknowingly invite other people to react in ways that confirm our assumptions about them, and then use those reactions to justify our initial assumptions and behaviors. That is so juicy that no one has talked about. So can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. One of the things that work we did in the book was to understand how our brain is constantly looking to confirm any bias we may or may not have. And if we've got a belief about somebody, they're not that smart, they're not capable, we think that's just our judgment of them. What we don't understand is how our behaviors manifest themselves and how it causes an opposite reaction in the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found is when I was, before I did a lot of work, I was fairly judgmental of people and put them in boxes. You're a really smart box, you get lots of positive reinforcement from me. You're not in the really smart box, you get a lot less positive enforcement from me. And when you're the person that's observing that and you notice that one person is getting positive feedback and you never get it, you start to conclude maybe things about me and what I believe about you. And so maybe you interact with me less. When you do interact with me, you're defensive. And that makes me believe even more, well, they're not very convicted about their job and they don't really know what they're doing. And so they retreat even more. And the process gets to the place where I'm actually creating a workplace ecosystem unknowingly that's causing individuals and teams to operate based on my judgments or my beliefs when I think it's sort of all in my head, but I'm creating a system where all these reactions are causing a lot of dysfunction.
What a crazy cycle.
It is a crazy cycle.
It makes so much sense, though, right? Because I think we all do that, and I've never really even thought about that almost organically sometimes happens. Why do you think that is?
Because it's unconscious, largely. I'm not aware of, let me think for a second. When I said that, let me pay attention to the person's reaction. Let me look through their lens. I believe we very rarely, at least I know I very rarely look through the lens of the other person. What it's like to be in their shoes. And we talk about walking in people's shoes, but think about looking through someone else's eyes and how they're viewing the interaction. And what's it like to be the one teammate around the table that's getting either not the positive feedback or in particular, potentially getting called on the spot. What would it be like to be that person in the room? And because it's unconscious, it starts to play out and it just takes off on its own. It's like a current, it's like a water current. You're not aware of it, but if you jump in the water, all of a sudden you're sucked out to sea. That's what ends up happening in companies all the time. And whether it's individuals or teams, and then it just is at that point in time. It's never anything you discuss along the way.
How do we change that? How do we fix that? Where does it begin?
Well, it begins with understanding that you do have this little thing in your brain called your ego that is constantly on alert and is constantly looking to keep you from either being hurt or being rejected or having some undesirable impact to you. And that means the people you work with are seen as threats to you. And until you understand that that's going on for everyone in the room, until you appreciate that's at play in every interaction and every moment, when you think about I'm coming on this podcast today, and I want you to think I'm smart, and I want you to think I have all the right words, and I don't even know you, but I come into this with some anxiety, and imagine the first question you put me on the spot. All of a sudden, now I start to judge myself. Well, maybe I'm not smart enough. And then my answer's not very good. You're like, well, that wasn't very smart of that guy. This is supposed to, he wrote a book. He should know that well. And all of a sudden, we go down a path. And I think you have to be aware that in every interaction we have, those are at play with us all the time.
Well, the challenge of actually getting on this podcast, I was going through that same thing. I'm like, oh my God, he must think I'm an idiot. I can't get that. Like, what's wrong with technology? And my business manager just went to lunch, and I'm like, where's the tech person to help me? And I'm like, oh my God, I look like a moron. And I had this entire conversation with myself while trying to troubleshoot.
Exactly. So when you're aware that conversation is going on, it gives you permission to turn it off.
Yeah.
You can say, I'm not actually going to be in my head right now. I'm going to be aware of it. And I'm also be aware of when I think someone else is in their head. I mean, I think what I was able to do over time was understand when I had a teammate that was Hijack, and the work we did with my co-author allowed us to together process things. And we learned about each other and what would cause someone to get distracted. And so we wouldn't do those things and hopefully not find ourselves down a path that was unproductive or distracting.
What are some of those things that will distract people?
It changes. I mean, I think the fears are the same. To me, they're the fear of not being included, the fear of being rejected, the fear of not being right, but they manifest themselves differently. And I'll give you a quick story. I had a direct report of mine who a couple of times a year would be in my office, really irate, very hot about something I had done or he thought I had done. And I couldn't figure it out. I didn't understand what I had said or what I hadn't said. Well, through the work we had done, we came to find out that early on, in his case, in his childhood, he was sort of labeled as learning disabled, which he actually wasn't. And he didn't like the feeling of being labeled as a kid who wasn't as good as the other kids. So anytime someone labeled another group, his brain quickly came to the defense of those people. And so whenever I would say something like, that group does this, for him, that brought up that fear and he came to their defense. So him yelling at me was not really about him yelling at me about the thing. It was him believing that I had done this. It was unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an extreme example. But for each person, we don't know what they are, but they generally threaten some sense of security. And it can be a small trivial thing in a group meeting, or it could be, being called out in a meeting or whatever it might be. But those things change for each individual. But the core of it is that fear of something happening to them that's hurtful.
I often talk about one of my biggest beliefs is that there's this universal truth of everybody needs and wants to be loved when you really boil it down. And I see this happen a lot in everything that we do, in training and specifically, or if I give a presentation and nobody sits in the front row, and I usually open that presentation with, why isn't anyone sitting in the front row? And we have this whole conversation about the fear of being called on and the fear of looking stupid and the fear of my colleagues thinking I don't know what I'm talking about if I get called on and I have to speak and it doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, we all have this desire to be liked.
Oh, it's so true. And, in my case, sort of that fear of being rejected is something that controlled my behaviors, especially when I became the CEO, because I thought the only way that people would like me is if I had all the answers. So I was controlling. Felt like I had to do everything. If I thought I was wrong, I would divert everyone's attention on some shiny thing in the corner. Yeah. Because I didn't want them to not like me, when in fact people like you a lot more when you admit you actually don't know something. That's the crazy thing is, if we just sat in the front row and said, I want to sit here because I really want to learn, because I'm not sure I know everything and this is really important to me. Okay, great. Now I know why you're there. But it's so hard to say that thing. It's easier just to fall into the back row and hope no one notices.
It's interesting. I hear what you're saying, and I've been in both positions. And there's something a little more liberating I've come to discover. It's a little more liberating to be imperfect and vulnerable. It seems like less work when you let your guard down.
Well, in a variety, I agree with you in a variety of ways. One is you don't have to remember who you told what to. So it's a little bit of, I'm not managing a story, like I'm managing the truth. Yeah. And it's one of the things I operate from is people can handle the truth, whatever it is. And they can handle bad truth and good truth. What they can't handle is being manipulated or feeling like they're being manipulated or not being told the whole story. And so it is liberating just to be authentic about what you're worried about, your fears are, what's not working. You get out of your head and you give them the gift of the truth.
I've always operated from that place, not 100%, right? Because we have that whole ego thing going on of protecting ourselves. But I've recently, maybe the past year or two, I've become far more vulnerable in certain situations, in leadership situations and speaking situations. And most recently, I gave a talk at a women's conference, and it was all about finding purpose. And it was more of a personal development talk. And we do this finding purpose piece with businesses as well. What's the purpose of the organization and the founder? And that really kind of creates the foundation. But in this particular situation, it was just personal development. So I didn't have a business angle to it. And it was a 1-hour talk. And at the end of it, there was a line of women waiting to talk to me. And several had sent me emails and text messages after the fact. And then I've had several meetings, and we're now in discussions with several companies for training because they like the talk so much about finding purpose. And there were so many women flocking about it. And I said, what? I really don't understand what I did. But there were women crying and moved. And somebody emailed me and said she quit her job because of me, which is scary. And another one said I changed her life in an hour. And I said, what did I do? Because I'm not really sure what I did that moved you guys. Because I really didn't know. And it kept coming back over and over again. You were so raw and naked truth and vulnerable, and you shared things with us that were hard, that you went through, and it made us all feel like it was okay for us to be who we were.
That's amazing, and it's interesting. One of the chapters in the book talks about the noble goal, and that we're all driven by what you just described, that we all want to sense that there's a purpose beyond making money, beyond completing a job task, that you're really there to do something that makes a difference. And one of the reasons I think this book is powerful is it's a book about a debt collection company. And I would ask you to name the top 500 industries you'd go work for. It would not show up on the list, right? You would not write down debt collections. And nobody would at the end of the day. It's not an industry most people come up with. But this is an industry, and this is a company where by the time I left, we had a subsidiary in India. It was ranked the 14th best company to work for in all of India by the Great Places to Work Institute. And so I think this pursuit of culture and a pursuit of a noble goal can do great things and can drive great results independent of the industry, because that's what people want. They want to work for that. You get discretionary effort for that. And that authenticity you showed made it okay for them to show. And imagine that in a workplace, the cascading event, if you all worked together, everyone now felt like they could share what their fears or what their concerns were, what wasn't working. When they're just stuck, maybe they don't want to be there, but they want to talk to somebody about it. It opens the door to all those conversations that are important.
It was pretty surprising for me. I mean, I'm a pretty effective speaker, but this was one of those, wow, I really hit this out of the ballpark, and I don't even know what I just did other than show up, be me. And it had the most traction of any talk I've given from a business perspective. So it was an interesting kind of dichotomy of I just went to try to rah-rah these women into, personal development. And it turned into several business meetings for discussions on hiring us. So it was kind of a unexpected phenomenon, I guess you could say.
Well, we live in a reality TV superficial world. And when you crave connection, when you crave getting to know somebody's individual, you don't experience it now day in and day out. It's right at the surface. So you went deep, and I think that's a big premise of this book that we wrote, which is that's what actually I believe that's what makes the difference in becoming okay and becoming great and creating a different culture than you would have otherwise. Because without that, everyone stays at the surface, which means you don't tap their full potential.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk a little bit about your philosophy on the dollar cost behind ego. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
To me, the dollar cost of ego are all the things that either don't get accomplished because groups are, one of the things we talk about in the book is us versus them dynamics. So it's individuals or groups. And a lot of times people talk about delays in projects or something that didn't get done, or a division that went too long with an idea that probably should have been stopped sooner. Those are the dollar cost of the ecosystem. The inability to make pivotal, critical business decisions because of interpersonal dynamics, because of group dynamics, because of, back to the fear of wanting to be liked. If you have a division that's lost money for 5 years in a row, it's probably going to make money, but to shut it down means maybe those people aren't going to like you. maybe just keep putting that off. In our case, we owned this. We bought a company, and it didn't grow for the 7 years we owned it. And it took me a long time to sort of make the decision to part ways with it. We actually sold to another company. But in my head, I think there's a lot of, well, they won't like me, or people won't think that I'm a smart businessman if I bought a company and then sold it. So those are the dollar cost of the ecosystem. All of those pivotal decisions that either don't get made or get made on a delayed basis because you're just unable to focus everyone's mental and physical resources towards the most important problems.
What is your advice going forward? I know that you've outlined a couple different things that people, especially CEOs and leaders, can do to get out of this ego problem. What are some critical strategies for disrupting an organization to go from dysfunctional to productive?
Well, I think it's important to declare it as a goal. As a company, our culture, we went through a difficult period of time sort of during the financial crisis. And we had a lot of people pointing fingers in different directions and blaming other people. And we were very good at pointing out problems. We weren't really good at solving them collectively. And so we named the dysfunctions. We named, here are the things that we're doing today that we don't want to do. And here are the things that we want to be 1, 2, 3 years from now. And so we declare the change in the culture that we want. And I think it's important to do that. And that's not put a plaque on a wall that says integrity matters.
Yeah.
It means being very clear that we want to, you're right, we want to go from blaming to co-responsibility. And here's what that looks like. The second thing is the change has to come absolutely 100% from the top. The leadership has got to look at themselves, get feedback and input, and know that until they start to change and make decisions differently and interact differently, they can't expect other people to do that. And the premise of the book is I hired an outside development firm to fix my direct reports. I was fine. They all needed the help. And the realization was the biggest problem was me. And I was the one who had to change the most. And so that's a tough realization to come to. But I think that it was one I needed to come to. So you have to know that change starts at the top. And you can change. I believe you can change any behavior if you understand the impact you have. The third goes back to what we said earlier, which is understand the cost. And that's either the cost to an individual of an interaction, that's the cost to your business of not making the changes. And then you have to find something more important than protecting yourself to make a great culture, to do something differently. And that's finding a goal that back to in your heart you want to go and achieve. And that will keep you from getting kind of going astray. But if you come up with something that's powerful, that would drive you to make the difficult decisions, or your teams to make the difficult decisions, even when it puts your ego at risk or those fears come up, I think that allows you to persevere and see through it.
You made a comment about you were the biggest problem, and you had an outside consulting firm kind of come in and work with you. Was that before realizing you brought in the outside company to fix the problems and then realized you were the problem? Is that accurate?
That's correct. I hired a leadership development firm to come in, and we had hired a bunch of new people, started a bunch of initiatives, and I wanted to accelerate the norming, storming, forming, performing process. And so I felt like they needed the help. I'd been there for 10 years. I knew the company. They all needed the help. And 6 or 8 months into the process, things weren't getting better. Relationships were fractured deeper. We weren't making progress on some key initiatives. And my co-author, who was the president of the firm, Shane, flew down to meet with me, and I thought we were going to have a working session. Well, he flew down to fire me as a client, and which doesn't normally happen. Normally people you're paying don't fire you. And he sat me down, and actually in a very kind way, to fire me, and just said, things aren't changing because you're not willing to work on yourself. And so all the dysfunction that's at play, until you're willing to look at yourself in the mirror, until you're willing to really find a way to break through some of these behaviors that are causing ripple effects in the organization, there's not going to be change. And we don't want to deal with people telling us all the things they don't like about the company that you're unwilling to change. So it took me about 9 months to a year of them working ineffectively in our company to realize that actually he was right. And I don't know how he said it or in a way where I could hear it, but it was the first time I realized that it's something I have to work on. And then the big turning point for me personally was about a year later, we had to do a layoff. And to come into the office and to have to look a bunch of people in the eye who actually did nothing wrong except do their job and show up every day and work really hard, and they weren't going to have a paycheck 2 weeks from then or 8 weeks from then, whatever it might be, and I still did, was a feeling that I couldn't overcome that feeling for a while. And I made that decision in that moment that I was not going to let, because there were decisions I could have made to make that less of an issue, that put costs and issues in place sooner, not hoped it was going to get better. And I just wasn't going to be in that place again. And so I was not going to make another employee that worked for me have to have that conversation with somebody because of decisions I could have made differently.
What an amazing learning opportunity. Painful, I'm sure.
Painful it was, but it was, and it was an opportunity, I think, for all of us, the entire leadership team. We looked at each other and said, we're going to figure this out. Like, we're going to change the culture. We're not going to be here again. We are going to persevere. And we had plenty of bumps that happened along the way, but instead of blaming each other and pointing fingers all the time, we started solving problems. We started moving resources around to the biggest problems. We started taking advantage of opportunities. We did shut some things down that weren't working, but we did them in a humane and in a way that the employees ended up in a good place in the end. But we shifted our approach. Again, you don't want anyone to kind of have to have that as the moment where they shift their approach, because that's the ultimate cost of the ecosystem in some ways, where people lose their job.
Yeah.
But for me, it was a gift to actually kickstart or turbocharge my development as a leader.
What were some of the things that you did? You're being told that you're the problem. What are some of the things that you did to help turn yourself around as a leader?
First, it started with things you said earlier, which is being transparent about my issues and how they were impacted, how I viewed them impacting the company. And I had to sit down with all of my direct reports and even the company and declare those. I started talking openly within the company about the things I worried about. And I stopped trying to protect myself from being CEO of the year, which I wasn't, quite frankly, if you looked at any measure that you would look at, and spent more time creating context, opening up the floor for discussion, giving people the ability to talk about what they were worried about. But we started to talk about the important issues. I started to focus the organization on the most important things. One of the compensating behaviors I had was I would have so many initiatives that if we failed, it wasn't because we didn't try. Right? If you do 30 things and 27 do well and 3 fail, well, that's a pretty good batting average, unless the 3 that fail are the most important ones. And so I stopped distracting everyone else, and we started agreeing on, here are the 3 things we have to do well. And so we created great focus on what was most pivotal, full well knowing that if it didn't work, then that was my call and it was my fault. But I needed to be able to provide that clarity for us to succeed. And so we created focus and we created clarity, and we didn't get distracted. And that was a huge benefit. And then I tackled our biggest problem openly within the company. And our biggest problem was our costs were too high, and they were unsustainably high given what was happening in the business. And the only way for us to succeed in the U.S. was to succeed in India. And it was something that, this is 2007, 2008. Even today, there's a lot of negative beliefs about what happens if a job is not in the United States. But we weren't going to succeed if every job was in the United States. And we found a way to work together openly and in a trusting manner, and created a great company. We doubled the workforce in the U.S. We doubled the workforce in India, and we created a great company. But if we hadn't solved that problem, we would have never gotten there. And the only way to do that was to do it in an open, transparent way and not trying to blame one side or the other.
So you have this book, Ego-Free Leadership, Ending the Unconscious Habits That Hijacked Your Business. Anything you would like to share about that to entice our listeners to go out and buy it?
I have lots of things I could share. The one thing I would share relating back to your conversation earlier is there's a great chapter in the book written by one of my direct reports who's a woman, and it talks about the overlay that women have in business that men don't have. And we sort of look at her ascent, and she did a great ascent in her career as a woman. But at some point, she sort of asked the question of, was she sort of held back as a woman? And we had a great conversation, one that I don't think normally happens in business. And her question essentially was, if her name was Andy, not Amy, would have she gotten to the top faster? And were there things that were keeping her from being successful sooner? And it was a great revelation for me. And it's like I said, it's the kind of conversation I'm grateful that I got to have with a key team member. But it's not the kind of thing that people talk about anymore, because it sounds like, sexism or one of the topics we don't want to talk about. But I believe it's really potentially about filters you have and beliefs you have and your ego. And so we try to bring out some conversations that aren't naturally there and you wouldn't expect to see in a book. And I think for women readers, it'd be interesting to look at the parallel of their careers versus Amy, and hopefully get some insights from it. So that's kind of going back to your conference a little while ago, but I think that's a unique thing for people to look through.
That's enticing. That makes me want to read it, because I think that's a really strong thing that we don't really talk about as much, because I think there's some sense of taboo around it nowadays. We're so careful with everything we say. We don't want to offend people, and what's politically correct to talk about. I even have some perspective and points of view on complaints around women don't get paid as much as men, and that's a whole nother podcast. But I think there's a lot of sensitivities around that, around gender. So I'm sure that's got to be an awesome chapter in the book.
Well, and pay is part of the chapter. So I think it may hit all the things that you would think about. It's not an entire book, and I'm sure you'll write one, but these are the things we don't talk about. And if we talk about them, we talk about them kind of at each other, not sort of sitting next to each other and having a conversation about help me understand. And that's, I'm grateful that I got to have those conversations with her. And I think the readers will appreciate it.
So what would be some of your advice around talking around the stereotypes that we're afraid to talk about? And we hit on women, so I'll continue to use that as an example. How do we open those conversations without feeling like we're crossing the political correctness line and feeling like we might be saying the wrong thing? But like we've been talking about throughout this podcast, the need to be vulnerable and transparent, I think, is so important.
Well, I agree. And I think it starts with intent, right? What is the goal of the conversation? And I think establishing the intent is really important. And the conversation can't be, I think I'm underpaid. Like, that's just not going to go very well. If you say, look, I've had something that I've been struggling with. I'm not sure exactly how to bring up. I'd love to process it with you. At least you start the conversation from a place of not putting the person on the spot. And I think a lot of the, as a white male who's never been a minority or never been in that situation, I don't actually know. It's hard for me to look through that lens. It's one of the few lenses. I can look through the fear lens because I've been there before. I can look through the wanting to be liked lens. I've been there before. I haven't been through the minority lens before.
Right.
So I don't know the right question. I don't know the right way to ask it. And I think my intent is to understand what the barriers are, and what do we really mean by, in our case, we had not nearly as many minorities and women in our executive leadership team. And in my conversation with Amy over time, it wasn't just about the number of people in the room. It was about the lack of mentorship for women and resources they could go to. The layers to this are significant, and I didn't appreciate that at all when we had the conversation. But I think it starts with a trusting relationship where the intent is just to have a conversation about it and not to put one person on the spot. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it won't be, there's some tension there. I mean, this is someone I'd worked with 10 years. And if you'd have said to me, is there any chance that Amy's got some sort of deep-seated concern that she wasn't promoted because she was a woman, I would have said no chance. And I was completely wrong. So, but I think the conversation can happen, and it probably takes a couple of times to have it, and it can't be in sort of a point the finger way, but they're really important discussions to have. And at least I was unaware of, and I distilled the problem down into a numbers problem, and it's really not. It's a much bigger issue. And the more I understood it, the more I could appreciate it.
I recently had a conversation about this around diversity. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier about being able to see through the lens. And somehow we have to find a way to put ourselves in the lens, even if we haven't been there. And I was having a conversation about diversity. And I sit on a diversity council. And the first year, it was a brand new council through our chamber. And the first year of it, I was one of 2 white women on the council. And I felt extremely intimidated and afraid to speak because I didn't want to be perceived as the white woman pushing my way through the conversation, if that makes any sense. And this goes back to everything you talk about, the ego, the conversations I was having with myself. And then I was sharing this with a Black woman who is actually at my talk that I talked about, that women's conference. And we had this very candid conversation. It was so powerful because I told her, I said, I felt so out of place and so uncomfortable, and now I get it. And she said, thank you. I'm like, I couldn't get it before. I didn't understand it. And again, it's like, how can we find a way to put ourselves in those positions and put those lenses on to at least make an attempt at understanding people?
What a great example. And I think until we find a way to sort of immerse ourselves almost like that, it's going to be hard. And we have a disproportionate people who are in leadership roles that are white and that have grown up in situations where they haven't felt the need to have to overcome these other barriers. I think women can certainly do it more than men. They've had to overcome becoming a woman and being a successful businesswoman. But certainly you can imagine with each layer how those conversations in the head must be that much more significant because you're adding more layers, more conversations. What do they think? So great revelation on your part.
Thank you. Hey, this has been such a great conversation with you. I really appreciate you being on the Pivotal Leader today, Brandon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it as well.
If people want to connect with you or get your book or find out more about you, what is the best way to connect with you?
Well, the best way to connect with me would probably be LinkedIn. So look me up on LinkedIn, Brandon Black. The book, go to egofreeleadership.com. It will take you to the landing page for the book, or go to Amazon and key in Ego Free Leadership. But I love to be contacted by anybody who found the podcast interesting and would respond immediately.
Awesome. And you know what? There's the most important question I have on every podcast now that people know how to connect with you. This is our magical end of the podcast question. And the question is, and I think you'll appreciate this, based on how you have come around and transformed, what kind of business animal is Brandon and why?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I would say I'm a dolphin. I think I'm pretty smart. I like to be in pods with groups of people, and I like to sort of solve problems collectively. So I think I'd be a dolphin.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you for that. And thank you again so much for being on this podcast. We will include your information in our show notes for this podcast. So once again, thanks to Brandon. Thanks to everybody for listening today to the Pivotal Leader. As I mentioned, we will include contact information for Brandon in our show notes at thepivotalleader.com. That's our website for this podcast. The Pivotal Leader is a production of Pivot 10 Results, a strategy and training company that helps businesses shift from people problems to performance results. Remember, you can find our podcast on iTunes, and if you're an iTunes subscriber, please leave a rating and a review. And don't forget to email me if you have any questions about employee engagement or customer acquisition. You can email me at gina@pivot10.com, and I'll answer those questions in future podcasts. And until next time, everybody, if you're feeling stuck in your business, it's probably time for you to pivot. You've been listening to The Pivotal Leader. To learn more about how to shift your culture and pivot to success, visit pivot10results.com. That's pivot10results.com.